Guys, this is a disaster for South Africa. This is not a way to begin the new year 2025. It says that 38,000 taxpayers have actually just ended their tax residency in South Africa. And this is actually going to cost the South African economy a whopping 3 billion rand. It also says that in 2023, almost 1,700 millionaires, they actually changed their tax residency, all right, from South Africa, and it actually cost 5 billion rand in taxable income and also 2 billion rand in assessed tax. And this is all in the context in a space where we are arguing that South Africa's unemployment rate is getting higher than even the supported or argued 33.3%. If we take in, the number of South Africans that have given up on ever finding a job in South Africa, that number rises to 41.9%, thereabout. If you now take in the number for aged 15 to 29 in South Africa, the youth bulge, that number of unemployed in South Africa rises to 71 or 79%, thereabout. And yet, we have this large number of taxpayers leaving South Africa. This is a disaster. Let's quickly listen to this really intelligent analyst. He's from First Source Money. He's the executive, Reg Nkosi. I really enjoyed this video. I could listen to it all day. I admonish you guys to listen to the end because he actually breaks down the basic problems that are actually going to hit and affect everybody living in South Africa if what I'm seeing, this whole exodus, so to speak, of the millionaires in South Africa, of taxpayers in South Africa, continues at this rate, no one in South Africa is going to escape this. Let's quickly listen to this interview and I'll be back for an analysis.
Welcome back. Now, 38,000 taxpayers have ended their tax residency in South Africa, costing the revenue collector a whopping 3 billion rand. SARS says in 2023, approximately 1,700 millionaires changed their tax residency status, representing almost 5 billion rand in taxable income and almost 2 billion rand in assessed tax. First Source Money Executive Director Reg Nkosi joins us for more on this discussion. Very good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you for your time. Why is South Africa losing its millionaires and losing its tax residents?
Well, firstly, it's very difficult to ascertain that the reasons why we're losing these persons. There are essentially two. It could be migration. The second would be taking up income in a different jurisdiction from that of Pretoria. Therefore, they cannot be paying Pretoria any tax if they're earning the income elsewhere outside of Pretoria. So to that extent, therefore, you see that the numbers are going down. But I think this trend has been there for quite a while, where South Africans have been migrating. And it should be seen that it is more of migration than just temporarily taking up residence elsewhere for tax purposes.
Yeah. Can a taxpayer still be a South African citizen while being a tax resident in another or multiple countries?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. For as long as my income is not derived from within the Republic, there's no need for me to be paying the Republic, unless I have some assets here, which then I'll certainly have to be paying should the need for such assets or tax to be paid on those assets. Otherwise, I can be resident in Saudi Arabia, for example, for 5, 10 or so many years. I'll be paying the tax there if they do pay tax, which I don't think they do. But in any other jurisdiction for that matter, you can therefore be a South African, a very well South African, not having changed anything apart from your tax residence only. Yes, but what we know, however, is that we've had quite a few South Africans jumping ship and wanting to settle elsewhere, and that has been rather common. But also, indeed, it has been common that South Africans are working some other places. So we cannot rule out this number as being almost half-half or, anywhere in the regions where the migration is taking up a slightly bigger chunk.
Yeah. So if a person ceases to be a South African tax resident, can they still get taxed on their South African sourced income?
Well, unless the income is sourced domestically, but otherwise it can't be taxed. Remember, the only tax you can pay is when you derive your income from here. I know some people derive income from elsewhere, but it comes in South Africa, but you're based here and you're offering services somewhere, and of course you have to be taxed in South Africa. But those who completely move out of here and stay in whichever country it is for whatever number of years, they don't have to pay the South African tax system. The only time they can pay is when they have the assets domiciled here. Then certainly they can do that. But otherwise, there's no need for them to be taxed if they're staying in the UK, for example, and earning a living there and staying with their families outside of the jurisdiction of their own birth.
Yeah, what would you say are the demographics when it comes to the tax bracket of those that have been noted to have, decreased the value of taxable income and tax that is paid?
These are fairly mobile people. You're looking at persons who earn no less than over R500,000. So essentially, they're in the regions of over 1 million in real sense. So yeah, you're talking about people whose consumption is needed in the country for economic growth and so on and so forth. And then we are losing all these persons to outside jurisdictions. Now, demographically, you're looking at persons in the regions of 35 years and upwards. These are fairly educated persons and somewhat established, and largely also a mixture of both black and white, because in the past, of course, there has been quite a number of European-based South Africans going out, but in the recent past, we've seen quite a number of Africans also moving out of the country to pick up positions or pick up jobs outside of the Republic. But in terms of monetary-wise, these are persons who frankly earn a lot more than R1 million. There's no doubt about that.
I know you say it's difficult to tell, but what would you say, if you were to say, the kind of official tracking points that perhaps government follows to determine these patterns and these trends?
Oh, yeah, of course, the government is tracking all this, and they're not keeping quiet. They know some are also on the campaign of making sure that South Africans come back home, especially those who have not migrated completely. But even those who have migrated, we know of a campaign a while back when they're trying to pull South Africans back home. But, yeah, the numbers are there. Statistics are there. And the larger population has been European-based South Africans who have been migrating. But in the recent past, we've seen quite a number of Africans themselves also taking up positions elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I think the general issue here is that these South Africans are earning a lot of money and whose economic activity is well sought in the country. And the loss of that, not just for tax purposes, I think for the economy broadly, in terms of consumption, expenditure, it's not good. It doesn't augur well for the Republic at all.
Yes, and obviously it can't be good for the public purse. How bad can it be when it comes to the consequences of such?
Yeah, absolutely bad. There's no doubt. I mean, remember the South African economy, or rather the framework which South Africa uses for growing its economy is one that depends on tax as revenue. Which revenue must finance or fund economic activities in the country. And where government doesn't fund such type of activities because there's less tax, the implications are easy. It means we have to borrow. You have to pay lots of interest on that. Normally, the borrowing is in external, it could be domestic, but also largely international, as we've seen in the recent past, even if foreign borrowings are in the regions of about 10%. But nonetheless, borrowing and interest rates are pretty high. That may stunt economic growth as a consequence of such people being out of the Republic. So the consequences are many. Outside of consumption, these are supposed to be investors. They're supposed to invest in their own country. They're supposed to be SMMEs. Come up with new companies and so on, and therefore create employment and grow the economy. Then we end up losing. The consequences are quite ghastly, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so clearly something is going wrong if these people are divesting and going to other countries. What incentives can government look at to try and woo these people back and their millions into the country?
I think the first thing that we have to know is South Africa is a highly taxed country. And if the government is to think about one thing, is to lessen the tax that is imposed on the citizens. It's not just the pay as you earn, as we've come to know, that all manner of taxes that are piled on a citizen, and we think that's overbearing. And people decide then, what's the future if I have to surrender almost half of my earnings to government? Yet perhaps I'm not even able to get good services, no good roads and stuff like that. So government has to devise a system where they're going to have to lessen the tax on the citizens, but fundamentally they have to grow the economy. With opportunities of doing business should be heightened, supporting small businesses, supporting other businesses as well. That it is possible, therefore, for all these people who want to go outside to stay at home and begin to take up the opportunities that the government is creating. And government has to do that, including as well what people call creating the environment necessary for small business to develop. But that is common. But largely for me is to ensure that the economy is growing, and governments have the capacity to do that.
Yeah, but the current government policies, are we likely to see this changing anytime soon, or is this trend likely to just continue happening?
I'm afraid there's nothing in the government policy regimes that we see from our side that would change anything. As we've talked about, things like growing the economy. The economy won't grow for another half a decade or more.
Yeah, brilliant and sad at the same time. But for this video, I don't want it to be too long. I just wanted to touch on something about this whole issue, because one of the major problems I hear a lot of business people in South Africa argue is about this whole thing with a 30% pass rate, you see, and that's actually as a form of the affirmative action policies of the ANC, the whole thing with the BEE as kind of like policy where there's a preferential preference, all right, in selecting employees, in selecting a labor force to work in the labor force, and having that as a policy might actually be contributing to this exodus of businesses, of millionaires, and those who are capable of producing spaces for unemployment to soak in the large number of employment. This whole problem with preferential preferences from the perspective of Thomas Sowell is actually one argument that people have argued is killing the labor force and the whole business space and growth in South Africa. So Thomas Sowell doesn't support this whole thing with preferential policies for a historically marginalized group of people. So he argues that a standard should remain the standard, so to speak. And let's just break it down anyway. So he says that partial preferences operate on the belief that selective preferential policies can be applied within a process while maintaining equality elsewhere. In other words, such policies often expand beyond their original scope and they undermine the principle of equal treatment. So in other words, in trying to put a 30% pass rate for maybe the blacks and the colored to be able to sort of like enable them compete effectively with the whites in South Africa, Thomas Sowell is actually arguing that those kinds of policies actually undermine the principle of equal treatment, and at the end of the day might even work against those who actually have been made to condition themselves to have this mentality of a 30% pass rate or low preferential preference to be able to compete in the wider labor force. So in the example, using the example of America, the United States, he says early affirmative action in the United States reflected this problem. It aimed to enhance minority recruitment while preserving equal treatment in selection and advancement, just like what we see in South Africa today. He says that President J.F. Kennedy's executive order 10,925, it was, this was the problem with that executive order. And it mandated affirmative action to ensure equal treatment regardless of race, creed, or ethnicity. Now, over time, it argues that this affirmative action then shifted towards prioritizing statistical outcomes. So you see, it's just almost kind of like the gameplay we are seeing in this whole new act with business in South Africa, where, like you could see the Employers Association executive argues that you cannot have your business on a spreadsheet. There can't be this statistical, so to speak, requirement for business in South Africa. So he says that when GFK passed that order, there was now the order now shifted to prioritizing statistical outcomes tied explicitly to race and ethnicity, which was now a trend that then mirrored globally. So this trend now seems to have be reaching South Africa in 2025. It says Thomas Sowell is arguing. He says that similar patterns emerge in other countries. In India, for example, he says that efforts to relax university admission standards for marginalized groups were introduced with assurances that they would not be affecting grading. In other words, the Indians believe that if they could reduce these admission standards for these marginalized groups, so to speak, it wouldn't affect the grades of these people as they tended, into the workforce. Nevertheless, as in the US, recruitment preferences often lead to lower admission standards and preferential grading to mitigate failure rates. All right. Malaysia, it says that in Malaysia institutionalizes such practices through review committees, while countries like New Zealand, for example, they establish tailored academic programs. I like this one, such as ethnic studies to accommodate specific groups. Anyways, Thomas Sowell argues that though preferential policies are often justified by moral arguments, such as we see the Land Act of 1913 in South Africa, could actually be a way to, or even the apartheid laws from the National Party from 1948 onwards, and actually be a way to justify these preferential policies. According to Sowell, he's saying that such as he says that these policies, so to speak, these preferential policies, they frequently persist long after these arguments lose relevance. And institutional inertia, what he calls institutional inertia, that's this whole stagnancy of institution, so to speak, and political momentum. He says that these drive their continuation, and then they raise ethical concerns about the long-term implications. Ultimately, according to Thomas Sowell, he says that ultimately preferential preferences tend to proliferate, challenging the feasibility of achieving true equality and necessitating critical evaluation of their consequences over time. So, for me, anyway, I've spoken to some of my friends in South Africa who have actually slowly explained to me this whole problem with the 30% pass rate for matrix in South Africa and all that, and how that is actually a statement by the government, so to speak, that these guys are not smart enough to compete with those who actually are made to pass with 50% and all that. Those are actually arguments that I actually also see. But also another problem is also the fact that if you decide to place somebody to achieve a 30% pass rate matric, all right, with a poorly qualified teacher, all right, you are increasing the problem. So and they're expected to, or probably even if we have to say, for example, blacks should be able to compete with the whites who actually have to pass at the 50% pass rate, all right, but they have poorly qualified teachers or poor teachers, so to speak, then it would actually be causing that whole divide to increase, because they will never be able to get to 50%, so to speak, and then continuously increase that inequality. So at the end of the day, I think the solution in this kind of problem would be a skills, a whole revamp of the skills training structure. The GNU, somehow, I don't know how it would be, but there's a need for a skills retraining revamp. There has to be these kinds of schools that emphasize on training skills, especially skills of the future. This kind of skills that actually are moving the world into a certain area or a certain direction in the future. There has to be those kind of small schools. All right. I actually saw an analysis of how the Indians also escaped the Bantu Education Act in 1953, and also I think it was the Indian Education Act of 1961 thereabout. All right. So even though the National Party marginalized the blacks, coloreds, and the Indians with this Education Act, I saw an article that argued that many Indian communities, so to speak, engage in their own kind of formal training. They now started training their children and all that. And at the end of the day, we saw that there was some sort of escape of that whole debasement, so to speak, in terms of training, in terms of growth, in terms of mindset that the Indians seem to have scaled, that we now then see that the colors, especially if we listen to Paddy Lehotla's argument, we could hear that he speaks about how the Indians and the whites, so to speak, sort of like left the blacks and the colors behind. It was because of this whole private kind of training that the individual communities, Indian communities, decided to take on themselves to train their own children, to train their people. And at the end of the day, by 1994, when everything was now kind of like normalized and everybody was now seen equal, the Indians were also seen to have a sort of like footing in competing with the whites, who had actually then, probably experienced a large proportion of the policies, so to speak, and sort of like um, capitalized on those policies, and but the Indians sort of like were still able to have a foothold in that competition, leaving behind the blacks and the colored. So now in the light of the GNU, there now has to be that kind of training, all right, for the coloreds, or the marginalized, generally what we call the marginalized in South Africa. There has to be these small schools that end up training for new skills and skills of the future, so that these people can actually be armed with skills that match the need of the labor force. And by the end of the day, we didn't think much about whether 30% pass rate or 50% pass rate. Those are important. I don't say we shouldn't focus on that, but there should be a shift towards skills training. There should be small schools, this kind of vocational schools that end up pushing these young lads into skills training. There are skills like computer programming, there are skills like video editing, there are skills like digital skills anyway, that then are slowly moving the world into a particular direction into the future. And if we have that multiplicity of schools and people getting trained into schools, then we might see a change in the mentality and a mind shift, and probably even an entrepreneurial skills that can then shift people's minds in try to look for a job, or job mentality in a society where there are no jobs, and now start training creators of employment rather than searchers for employment. So this is how I see one way to tackle this problem. And remember, I spoke about in 2025 we'll be speaking more of solutions here in Kwazemi, and I'll be offering some training soon in my own capacity to give back, so to speak. So for those of you who would be interested in trying to learn, especially for YouTube training people on how to really be content creators, and just teach or talk to people about something are passionate about, and actually try to make some money for yourself. Because in South Africa, I see this level of poverty and all, suffering, so to speak, by the marginalized Indians, colored, blacks. If you're able to have an interest in content creation, speaking, trying to teach people, or analyzing what you see around your community, I'll be having a training on YouTube, and I'll take you hand in hand, showing you each step of the way how to get there, in trying to become a content creator in 2025, and hopefully have a set of people with skills, at this level. But anyway, this is where I'll be stopping for this video. I don't know, what do you guys think about this whole analysis of the fact that 30,000 South Africans have changed their residency status, from South Africa, and probably moving abroad? Share your thoughts, where, in the comments.